Hello there. Today I hope I'm in for a bit of a treat. The wine I have here is from Germany. It says Mosel on the label, but these days the region that this vineyard calls into, I mean it always has been, but is now allowed to call itself a vineyard from the Saar. And this is a Scharzhofberger Riesling Spatlese from the lovely, superb 2015 vintage. And this is from the producer, the Bischofliche Weinguter from Trier. So, Spatlese, a late harvested wine, Riesling the grape variety. Scharzhofberg, arguably Germany's most highly reputed vineyard, certainly for Riesling, in the cool climate Saar Valley. And as I say, from a superb vintage, the 2015 vintage. I find using Wine Search as a fantastic resource for learning some of the minutiae of wines. I was slightly surprised to see in our description of this wine, Hohe Domkirche, which it made no sense. I couldn't see the name anywhere on the label here whatsoever. I wondered whether perhaps there was an error, but I did a bit of research, and it turns out that this particular winery, the Bischofliche Weinguter from Trier, the Episcopal Winery from the city of Trier, was formed in 1966 as an amalgamation of three estates, hence the three different symbols there on the label. And the three estates comprised the vineyard holdings of the Seminary from Trier, then the vineyard holdings of the Seminary School, which were separate, and the vineyard holdings of the Cathedral. And so the fact this is in our nomenclature, Hohe Domkirche, signifies the fact that this, prior to the union in 1966, belonged to the Cathedral at Trier. And Trier Cathedral is Germany's oldest church, very historic site. In fact, it claims to be the oldest cathedral north of the Alps. And its association with winemaking and owning vineyards goes back to at least the 13th century. That's where the records begin, at any rate. And of the vineyards that the cathedral owned, probably the jewel in its crown was the 6.3 hectares out of the total 28 hectares of this wonderful Scharzhofberg vineyard. The cathedral are also part owners of the Scharzhof. The site here at the bottom of this sort of steep hill has been owned by the church, or part of the church was owned by a monastery originally since 1030. In 1314, 4 vineyards on what is now the Scharzhof were bequeathed to the church, and in 1719 the buildings of the Scharzhof were constructed themselves. However, in the process of secularization, these ended up being auctioned off and were in fact bought by somebody called Johann Jakob Koch, and he was a former monk and supposedly bought this for his order and originally lived there with some of his fellow monks. However, in a slightly scandalous turn, turns out that Koch married his housekeeper, threw the other monks out, and the property became his. When he died in 1829, in a fit of remorse, his daughter Clara sold a portion, the oldest portion of the buildings and a portion of the vineyards, back to the cathedral in Trier. The remaining portion, the more modern portion of the buildings, and also the largest portion of the vineyards of the Scharzhofberg hill, remain in the hands of the Müller-Koch family, whose descendants today still own and run Scharzhof, the most famous producer of Scharzhofberg wines being Egon Müller. The Scharzhofberg vineyard is an isolated hill. It's relatively steep. It's between 60 and 30% steepness. It rises to, I think at the top, about 300 metres above sea level. The aspect is south to southeast, and the vineyards are constantly subject to cooling winds, so you can get quite a big difference between day and nighttime temperature, which is great for preserving acidity. The soils here are clay and silt slate. There's a red and grey Devonian slate that comprises most of the soil here, meaning it's friable and free draining. The soils get a little heavier towards the bottom, but in general this is free draining soil, so restricting vigour for the vines. The steep slopes here mean that the grapes are hand picked. The winery crushes everything actually at the Scharzhof, and ferments in 1,000-litre Fuder barrels. These are old barrels. They're made from German oak, predominantly from the Palatinate, I understand. And fermentation takes place with the ambient, the indigenous yeasts that have come in to the winery from the vineyards. Fermentation takes place very slowly because the cellars are cold. Aging goes on until the following summer with the fine lees in barrel, again in cold cellars. And then the wines are bottled sometime between June and August, prior to the next harvest. So let's see what we make of the wine, shall we? Starting off with the colour, that's a beautiful, bright, energetic colour with lovely depth. It's a relatively intense medium yellow with greenish hints. As I swirl the wine, it has very little viscosity whatsoever. This is a wine with 8.5% alcohol, so even the fact that it's got 75 grams per litre of sugar is not making it cling to the glass at all. So let's have a smell of the aromas and see what we make of those. Wow, that is beautiful. That's a very pungent, almost sort of waxy, honeyed lime note. Very distinctive liminess there. And really, it's a waxy, slightly toasty lime. I know those two seem to contrast there, but there's a real richness to the note. I've also heard people describe that as being a bit like sort of quince, which, yes, makes some sense. But it's not the sort of the floral lifted note. It's more that sort of waxy and intense, concentrated fruit note. So let's for taste and see what we make of the palate. Again, the fruit is that waxy lime with a ripe, toasty note to it. Touches of quince, almost heading towards, slight peachy notes, but it doesn't quite round itself out to be peachy. The wine is sweet, and the sweetness is a lovely, focused sweetness. That may seem odd, but it's a very clean sweetness, and that's what happens when you stop a fermentation or allow a fermentation to stop midway through. Because of the way that yeasts process sugars, they will process glucose first and leave fructose, which is the sweeter of the sugars, in the wine. And so you end up with this really lovely, clean, fresh sweetness. Underlying this lovely, intense fruit is a sort of a rapier-like acidity. You almost don't notice it because of the richness of the fruit, but really it's causing my mouth to water. The wine is light-bodied. It's not, maybe light to medium, but it's not particularly heavy, rich or dense. There's a slight oily texture to it, but it's not rich and oily. What you've got is the intensity of the fruit. The alcohol at 8.5% isn't overpowering the fruit. It's allowing it to continue right to the finish, where you've got that lovely, fresh, persistent liminess. The fruit has some real presence here. It's rich. There's a slightly honeyed note to it, but it's not sort of rounded and rich honey. The acidity keeps that freshness. It stops it from being in any way cloying. and these flavours, lovely sort of rich, honeyed, toasty, limey notes continuing long after the wine has left my mouth. So yes, I think that's a really lovely example of a nicely mature now Riesling Spatlese. The acidity it's got is such that, I mean, wines like this can age for decades. I would feel very happy leaving this another 20 years and probably longer. I've tried Scharzhofberger Spatleses from the 1950s and they were still lively and, you know, they'd come straight from the cellars, but, you know, fresh as a daisy. And this I'm sure will do much the same. Thank you very much for watching. Scharzhofberg, some fantastic wines. There are a number of producers make wines from the Scharzhofberg, and I'm sure you'll find that most of them would be very interesting to try. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed the video. If you do, please feel free to like it. Do feel free to share. Do think about following us on YouTube. Do leave any comments you have, your experiences with these wines, other similar wines, or any comments you have about the video. We'd love to hear what they are. I hope you'll manage at some stage in the near future to join us for another tasting, so I look forward to seeing you again. Bye now.